Hello, today we'll be talking about the constraints-led approach by Grace Crompton, Lucy Jones, Ben Pounder, Ted Johnson and Jenny Hesketh. This presentation aims to enhance the quality and effectiveness of the work at Great Sports Coaching, as well as educating coaches around non-linear pedagogical approaches. We will look deeply into what coaching is and how that differs from the constraints-led approach. We will then look at the relationship between the coach and the learner, as well as the motivational climate.
Coaching is becoming one of the fastest growing professions. According to Whitmore, this can be done in many different ways. Some coaches like to have a lot of control and input, whereas others are happy to take a step back and allow the players to do the thinking. Whatever technique you use, it's key to have the players at the front of your minds at all time and think about how you can benefit them the most. Coaching began to be regarded as an important element in the drive to increase levels of participation in sport within society as a whole, and more specifically as a means to enhance levels of performance in the international competition arena. At the heart of coaching lies the idea of empowering people by facilitating self-directed learning, personal growth, and performance. Flaherty stated these 3 points are the products of coaching. Long-term excellent performance, which is where the client meets the high objective standard of the discipline in which coaching is occurring. Self-correction is when all coached clients can observe when they are performing well and when they are not, and as a result of this, they will make any necessary adjustments by themselves. Lastly, self-generation is when there is always room for improvement and the client knows this.
Today we are focusing on the constraints-led approach. The constraints-led approach is when a coach manipulates constraints to challenge learners so that they develop their own movement patterns. The constraints-led approach was first a framework to capture how movement solutions are shaped and organized without being prescribed. This means that athletes have an active role in the learning process. Typically, knowledge is thought to be conceived as a pre-existing resource held by the coach, and learning is the process of transferring this knowledge into the mind of the learner. However, this is a very linear way of thinking. We'll be looking at the constraints-led approach and how it can push the boundaries of coaching, and we want to start to look at learning in a new light.
The constraints-led approach was first proposed by Newell in 1985 and is a proposition aimed to help coach and practice. This is a traditional model that involves the learner interacting with the environment and a task. As you can see, the learner is at the top of the triangle, which symbolizes how the athlete is always kept as a priority, and we as the coaches must take a holistic perspective of the learner, Renshaw 2016. Through the manipulation of constraints, different information is presented to the learner. The learner is then challenged to find out their own movement solution to the problems faced or to achieve the goal set out. According to Newell, constraints can be classified into 3 distinct categories to provide a coherent framework for understanding how coordination patterns emerge during goal-directed behavior. Organismic refers to characteristics of individual performers, such as genes, height, weight, or even muscle fat ratios. These unique characteristics represent resources that can now be used to solve movement problems that can lead to individual-specific adaptations by a performer. At the start of learning, novices are challenged with harnessing available motor system degrees of freedom to complete a task. However, if environmental conditions change, the basic pattern needs to be adapted. Performers who can quickly adapt to these conditions are in the control stage of learning. Secondly, environmental constraints. These involve the physical constraints such as light, temperature, and even gravity. Spectators also provide an environmental social constraint for learners. Task. This includes specific performance goals, rules, equipment, and implements to use during a physical activity. The most specific task constraint is the information available in the specific performance context that athletes can use to regulate their actions. It is the relationship between these 3 categories of constraints that channels the organization of movement and physical activity and the emergent performance outcome. The use of constraints is to promote and guide exploration. Alone, constraints do not influence the learner. It's the interaction which shapes the perceptual motor workspace of each learner. The contemporary view of the role of the coach in the constraints-led approach characterizes them as a monitor and manipulator of constraints on the learner, Camp and Butt in 2018. The coach is a designer whose role it is to shape these constraints
such that the practice consistently improves the learner's capability to perform a range of movements in different contexts. The coach aims to increase the person's capability so they can adapt to new circumstances. According to HL 2016, identifying the key rate limiters to current performance that an individual needs to work on at any stage of their development is a key skill for teachers and coaches. By this, HL 2016 means that the coach needs to understand his learners well and acknowledge what areas they are struggling with. From there, he can plan his coaching area accordingly. It has often been misinterpreted that the coach is quite detached and disengaged in this type of learning. However, it is more the opposite. They are pushing learners to think for themselves and acting as a gatekeeper to variability in constraints and behaviour, author Campbell-Bottom 2018. The coach forms a co-adaptive relationship with the learner, making adjustments to the constraints on practice based on emergent relationship-dependent information where the learner and coach mutually constrain each other's behaviour. The aims of the constraints-led approach is to identify the nature of interacting constraints that influence skill acquisition in learners. Additionally, a coach does not only want to push the learner out of his comfort zone, but also provide relevant information about where to explore during learning.
In the constraints-led approach, there is a clear emphasis on discovery learning and embracing a problem-solving mindset, as the learners must actively engage their learning rather than passively receive information. The clear disadvantage of the constraints approach is that because learners are encouraged to assemble their own unique solutions to motor programs, novices may struggle as they do not have the fundamental movement patterns. As a novice, the most common way to learn would be through an autocratic approach, as all the content and information is new to the learner. So being told what to do would be a faster way to learn and groove skills. However, the constraints-led approach could lead novices down a black hole, in the sense that they don't know what is right and what is wrong. The coach would have to be a lot more active and pose questions to these sorts of learners to make sure that they are creating good habits.
Now we'll be looking at the traditional linear approach. Ho states that the linear coaching is a style where it is assumed that one size fits all, and that a training session will suit the needs of every participant regardless of their individuality. This coaching style relies on repetition in developing motor programs through blocked practice. Coaches tend not to use constraints within their sessions and assume that the drill will be adequate in grooving and certain skill for every athlete. A linear approach does not account for individual agency or athlete preferences, the changing environment within competitive sport, the speed at which an athlete learns, or the influence of personality on learning.
This drill represents the linear approach to coaching. As you can see, this drill consists of the ball being
We will now be drawing on comparison between the constraints-led approach and the linear approach. Unlike the linear approach, where the learner is passive within the coaching practice, the constraints-led approach is based on the embodied cognition through the learner environment and learner-coach relationship. Linear approach relies on the repetition and entails limited amounts of decision-making within practice, whereas the constraints-led approach relies on the learner solving problems through multiple degrees of freedom. The most obvious difference between these approaches is that linear practices confront participants with prescribed learning environments and movements, whereas the whole forefront of the constraints-led approach is to generate a learning environment where the participant develops an understanding of skills through movement without prescription. The constraints-led approach therefore promotes the exploration of movement in order to develop understanding and expertise within skill acquisition. The interaction of constraints in practice illustrates the variability individuals face when competing in sport.
This drill represents the linear approach to coaching. As you can see, this drill consists of the ball being passed down the line before the player gets through the yellow poles. This is a very simplistic drill, as there are barely any constraints on the players. Additionally, it's very prescriptive and gives the player little room for creativity. They are given the perfect ball and simply have to pass it to their teammate without any other external factor. This drill is good for grooving basic skills, however, it is not realistic to a game situation, as in a game the movement of the ball would be uncertain, as well as defenders trying to get the ball off you. Additionally, external factors such as the weather could play a part. The ball being wet would make this basic skill of passing a lot harder. This drill represents a linear approach to coaching. We have now adapted this drill using a constraints-led approach. As you can see, we have tightened the area up and added in 2 defenders, which acts as a constraint and encourages the ball carrier to make a decision. This is more games-based, as this is the type of image that rugby players would see in a game, an overload in attack and a need to get the ball to the space quickly. This is done by drawing in defenders and tipping the ball to your teammate. This drill is key for a rugby player's holistic development, as it allows them to figure out their own movement patterns without being prescribed by the coach. If they are finding this drill easy, it can be adapted by increasing the width of the area so that the participants are encouraged to use a longer spin pass. We have now adapted this drill using a constraints-led approach. As you can see, we have tightened the area up.
Motivational climate is when coaches or athletes build a social situation in consideration to the goal orientations. Coaches create a psychological environment so athletes can feel safe to take interpersonal risks, as this allows athletes to develop their confidence, decision-making, skills, communication, and relationships between both the athlete and the coach. In this environment, coaches provide sessions where they will give the athletes instructions to follow while they overlook the session. From this, the coach will then provide the athletes with feedback, which will help benefit the motivation of the athletes for training or competition. There are 2 different goal orientations surrounding the motivational climate. These are named task and ego. Their involvement helps drive their ability and perception. If we focus on task-orientated athletes, we notice that they don't worry so much about protecting their egos. These athletes don't make excuses and take ownership over their mistakes. They are open to accepting criticism when being provided with feedback while focusing on the process. This motivates them to then get straight on with improving themselves while embracing competition. This is because they know it will make them a better athlete. In contrast to this, ego-oriented athletes are constantly worried about comparing themselves to others, and as a result of this, they try to bring others down while elevating themselves using arrogance. These athletes are afraid because they don't want to hurt their ego. A mastery climate refers to an environment that is inclusive, allowing developmentally appropriate motor skill progressions for all learners. Morgan and Carpenter suggest that within the mastery climate, there is an increase of decision-making and focus on activity improving the athlete's engagement on the drill, which could be beneficial to performance as enjoyment levels are high. In contrast, performance climate is one in which evaluation is relative to others and defeating others is of primary importance. Therefore, meaning the performance climate places focus on the athlete's achievements due to the high levels of competition created as a result of the pressure within the environment. In accordance with the performance climate incorporates the idea of that superior ability causes success. Therefore, performance anxiety of the athlete may increase as the environmental is competitive, so they will be striving for success. This will be beneficial for an advanced athlete, as a beginner athlete may not gain success if they become too worried about competition, therefore not focusing on learning the basic requirements and skills.
Target is an acronym for the pedagogical structures introduced by J. Epstein. Target was created because of the growing interest in creating mastery motivation climates to help participants maximize the benefits in different environments. As shown in the diagram, Target stands for task, authority, recognition, rewards and relationships, grouping, evaluation, and time. Task is the first dimension of the pedagogical structure. This is where the coaches present athletes with open tasks where they are expected to problem solve in a changing context. A task-focused drill reduces the chances of athletes comparing themselves to their peers. There is greater attention on the process rather than on the outcome, and coaches are encouraged to have one-on-ones with individuals, which will further promote learning. The next component of target is authority. This is where the coach rarely intervenes and lets the players do the drill and find the problem for themselves. This allows them to create their own motor programs. Students are involved in the decision-making and task design. However, it depends on the climate. As you saw from the video, this is an ego climate. This is when the coach makes all the decisions and has a large amount of authority. As you saw from the video, the coach is not involved in the decision-making process and is letting the athletes make their own decisions. This is when the coach is operating in a mastery climate. Both of these videos symbolize recognition, rewards, and relationships. Recognition is the third dimension of the coaching structure, and this requires coaches to understand when an individual is making progress. Grouping requires splitting the athletes into different sections, whether this is in a homogeneous or heterogeneous way, making sure athletes with similar abilities are placed together, or mixing all athletes with different abilities, which can promote learning, potentially for the less able athletes, who can learn from the better ones in the group. Evaluation requires self-referenced progress through peer and self-evaluation. The coach may intervene by constantly asking questions and giving feedback to the athletes. As you saw, the video shows the athlete and coach having a one-to-one, and it shows that their relationship is mutual and they are trying to understand each other better, specifically how the coach can challenge the learner more. The last dimension of the target structure is time, and this requires athletes to participate in the decision-making process at a pace that allows them to complete the task with full understanding. The timings should be more flexible to allow the athletes to accomplish the tasks. As you saw in the video, you can see the coach stopping the drill as he thinks it's an adequate amount of time for the athletes to learn and decision make. By setting problems for the athletes to solve, it is within the task section of the target model, as it causes the athletes to adjust their movements accordingly, trying to achieve short-term goals. Within the previously shown constraints approach drill, it highlights the athletes' need to alter their individual learning and development into team learning and development, as the athletes have to work together to get past the defenders through communicating to help the ball carrier decide whether to pass or run. These are some key points to summarize what the motivational climate is. The motivational climate is a social situation created by a coach. It's a psychological environment where the coach designs practice sessions to provide instructions and feedback, which benefits the athlete's motivation for training and competition. Lastly, with regards to the achievement goal orientations, this is described as ways to find success or failure. Thank you for listening, and we hope you have found this useful and it will enhance your coaching choices in the future.